Hello, Steve Goodwin here with anchor test video number 137. I'm going to show you footage of my testing of this 55-pound Mantus M1 anchor. Now you may be wondering, why test a 55-pounder when my normal large size anchor group centers around the 45-pound range? And the answer is two reasons. First, someone once asked me, hey, do the anchors that tend to be a little bit heavier in that group, do they have an advantage over the anchors that tend to be a little bit smaller or lighter? And it's quite a range. At the small end, we have a 40-pound Knox that I have tested, and at the upper end previously was the 51-pound Viking, just a colossal anchor. And indeed, if you look at my ranking chart, up at the top slots are generally occupied by the anchors that are in the upper 40s, 50 and 51-pound size. So it's a good question. If, for instance, the 43-pound Mantus M1 that I tested, again, it's advertised at 45, but only comes out at 43 pounds. If that was as heavy as those other anchors, would it do better as a comparison? Now, the 55-pounder does kind of leap ahead everything, but I believe if we test this and analyze the data compared to the smaller, we should be able to get a good idea of just how much scaling the anchor up a bit will affect the ranking. Now, the other reason I chose to test this was I was intrigued by the scantlings of this shank and some of the other hardware. If you go way back to my compilation video number 56, this was from 5 or 6 years ago. At that time, I'd only tested, maybe 6 or 8 of these 45-pound range anchors, and I was kind of trying to wrap things up. And you folks had been asking me, hey, which is the best anchor? And at the time, I was testing a Mantus M1 that only weighed 40 pounds. It made a change sometime between now and then. And I used words like spindly, and I just felt that for my sensibilities, and I've kind of got a robust, heavy boat here, it just didn't make sense to put a real lightweight looking anchor on it. I wanted something a bit more chunky. And indeed, the shank on that original 40-pounder, very thin, very long, and they had not modified it yet. There was actually less material in this region. Now, a few years ago, they did modify all the shank shape on all these M1 anchors. Includes this angle here, helps with self-deployment, but it also added a bit more material. I did report on that when I got this new version and said it was a bit stronger looking. But this 55-pounder, it is chunky. And what happens is when anchor designers have to choose the plate thickness, they don't get to choose the ideal increment of thickness that would be appropriate as they scale up all these different size of anchors. They kind of have to just choose what's available. And the break between one plate size and the next happens between the 45 and the 55-pounder. And I think for other manufacturers, they choose that break somewhere else, because most of the 45-pound range anchors, they have the thicker plate. But anyway, by the time you get to the 55-pounder, it's got this nice chunky plate. All these M1 shanks are made from a very high grade of steel. Be very, very difficult to bend this anchor. And for my sensibilities, it just looked right. Also, the bolts went up a size. The plate here that the shank is welded to, that's thicker. Overall, very chunky, and I consider that to be an equal with all the rest of the anchors. Now, all these M1 anchors do have very large, tall roll bars that I believe are susceptible to bending back under very, very extreme conditions. Also, the toes of the anchor are flat, and like the Viking anchors, if you get this caught under a immobile ledge and pull up very, very strong, I think there is some small chance that you could bend that down. Mantus did make another improvement a few years back where they changed the shape of this thickened area. It provides more material traveling back up the folded part of the anchor, and that's a bit stronger. I don't want to test this to destruction, but there's no question there are stronger toes out there. But I think it's pretty adequate for normal anchoring. So this anchor does get a better rating on my sort of engineering and strength column, but it's still not the best compared to all the other anchors. So as I said, this anchor does weigh 55 pounds on my scale, and when it's over on its side in the setting position, half of the weight is on the toe. So it retains that best in class 50% tip to total weight ratio. Also, all of the M1 anchors have just a perfectly shaped shackle or chain attach point. The bosses of any conceivable shackle that you'd want to use for this anchor will pass through nicely, and there'll be no binding. As I said before, with this new shank shape, self-deployment is strong. Not the absolute strongest, but still very, very good self-deploying power. All right, let's get on the water and see how the anchor does. First area is the cobblestone seabed. The stones range up to about grapefruit size and are quite consistent. The anchors are able to set and reset and repeat the performance over and over very consistently. Here the anchor is holding about 620 pounds. Apply a little bit more thrust and it starts to move, and then it resets and repeats. This is about 11.3 units of holding per anchor weight, which is almost the best. The very best was the Viking 51. That one had about 16.5 units of holding per anchor weight, and compared to the 45-pound Mantus M1, it's a little better. That 45-pounder was about 8.5. Next area is the clean, loose sand seabed. It is nice, clean, loose sand at the surface. However, there is a bit of binder, maybe a foot or so below the surface. Now, this is one of these tests where I do not normalize the outcomes, meaning I don't divide by the anchor weight. So here it's just head-to-head, and this is a situation where a larger anchor is at an advantage. And indeed, the anchor does a bit better than the 45-pound version of this anchor. It does not quite do perfectly well, meaning it doesn't do as well as the very, very best, but it's very close. Really, it's kind of splitting hairs. Without doing the winch testing at this site, I really can't tell what the ultimate holding power is, but safe to say the anchor doesn't move much at all throughout the veer. That was being pulled at 860 pounds, and now I'm pulling straight ahead, no veering, at 1,325 pounds, and boy, it takes a real sharp eye, but you can just barely see those chain links just creeping along by some of those debris on the surface. But no, that's real good performance. Roll bars completely out of sight. Here we do see some of that bound material on the fluke of the anchor, but it washes away by the time it gets to the surface. Next test is the 180-degree reset in the sandy mud. Here I set the anchor firmly in its initial direction, then I turn the boat around and drive directly up and over the anchor to simulate wind or current reversals. You can see the chain just right across the top of the anchor and you hear it clicking on the roll bar, so I nailed the reset course. And typically when that happens, an anchor will do a backflip. However, these Mantus M1 anchors have a strong tendency to remain upright and just pivot in the seabed, and that's exactly what we saw for this first reset. Second reset's a little murky, you don't see it quite as well, but we get the same effect. The anchor does not release from the seabed, it just pivots and rotates, and that's as good as it gets. In fact, this anchor is just perfect here for all 10 resets. However, sometimes, like this one, the anchor does disengage a bit. I call that a partial disengagement, but resets right away within a couple anchor lengths. Certainly nothing wrong with that, that's just fine. I'm going to skip most of these, but that one there was a full backflip. We saw the anchor was upside down. It rotated nicely and reset. That's all I'll show you. It was 10 for 10. Okay, most of those were rock solid, really, really short resets. Two of them, 2 or 3 might have been a couple more anchor lengths, maybe 3, I don't know. But excellent. 10 for 10, perfect resetting. Next is a veering test in the sandy mud. Scopes up to about 7-to-1 with this test. I'm using an all-rope rode. Anchor sets perfectly right off the bat and buries mostly out of sight. We are watching this at 8 times camera speed, and now the boat is moving to starboard. Usually the boat swings around about at a knot and a half, and we can start to see the anchor pivoting on around, and it really does extremely well here. This is another situation where a larger anchor will be at an advantage. I do not normalize any of this data. They all just get the same treatment. The 45-pound version of this anchor actually had a release toward the end Working from memory, it was more of a partial release in the straight line portion, and there was significant motion. This anchor doesn't really have much of that. There was a touch there, but here we are straight line pulling up at the maximum of the boat, and not a lot of motion. Next is a winch test here in the sandy mud. It's a straight line holding power check. In the lower left, you see a digital readout. That's the pounds of pull on a dead man anchor rode, and it's the same amount of force applied to this test anchor rode. We'll see we're up into the 2000s now, and the anchor is mostly buried. A little bit of the roll bar is still visible. Occasionally you'll see it come into the frame. And right now we're at the maximum, peaked up there around 3,100 pounds of pull, and it hovered around 3,000, upper twos for a while, then slowly decayed. Now this anchor, none of the Mantus M1 anchors in these maximum holding checks in this seabed are right up near the top. They are, let's call it, middle of the pack. What I believe is happening is the anchor is partially mud fouling. There's a lot of irregularity to the surface of the fluke near the base of the shank. There's bolts, there's plates, and I believe mud and seabed hangs up there, and I think that affects performance. We'll talk more about that on the bench at the end of the video, but this anchor doesn't give up completely. It hangs around here in the upper teens for a long time, and like in the reset test that we already saw, it's tenacious. This anchor likes to be bit into the seabed significantly, but it's just not as good as the very best for this test. Very best anchors will make up to 5,000 pounds, and some of them will just stay completely buried with very, very high holding as far as I can drag them. I always drag these anchors about 90 feet, and I'm showing you all of this. Again, it's 4 times playback speed to get through quickly. And what you see is what you get. A consistent teens, but again, back in the early part, it did have a nice peak of 3,100 pounds, which equals, that's going to equate to a very, very strong wind. Depends on the size of boat, but that's well up into storm or maybe small hurricane force. Here's take 2 for this same test with the 55-pound Mantus M1. Very similar result. This time the peak was just a touch better. It was 3,300 pounds, and if I average all that together and divide by the anchor weight, I get a holding factor in the low 50s. The holding factor for the 45-pound version of this anchor was up in the 70s, so a little bit better. Don't have an explanation for that, but in any event, this anchor, again, is right middle of the pack amongst these 45-pound range anchors. I'm not going to show you the full sequence, but it was very similar to that first one in that after the peak, it was the full 90 feet hovering in the teens, sometimes a little more, sometimes a little less, but never a full release. Always doing its darn best to stay engaged. So here I'm analyzing this seabed that tends to clump around the base of the shank. I think what's happening is under high force or high loads, there's a lot of compression going on, and I believe the water squeezes out for the most part, leaving a higher concentration of just sand and binder, and it just won't flow. I'm having to push real hard with my hand to get that stuff to move. I know that when this substrate is more watery, it'll tend to be a bit more liquid-like. So you can see there's bolts sticking up and those plate irregularities. It's all contributing, I believe, to stuff hanging up there. And yeah, I'm convinced more than ever that if you've got stuff clogging up onto your fluke, it's going to negatively affect the ultimate holding power of the anchor. Now we're onto the location where this Mantus M1 and virtually all other roll bar type anchors do really, really well. This is Scow Bay with the soft mud. First test here is a veer. The baseline pull is 535 pounds. As you can see, we got the boat moving to starboard, and I let it swing all the way through 180 degrees. Not much for video footage on the seafloor. It's very turbid here. Can't really see anything. But looking at the GPS track and just the glassy water there, I can really tell if the boat has got any forward motion, and it really did not have any during that veer. This is a straight line ramp up to the maximum pull of the test boat. Goes up to 1,325 pounds, but it didn't make it there. This anchor was solid on the GPS, so 0 knots on the GPS at just over 1,000 pounds, and then started moving faster and faster with more thrust. Now, the holding in this soft mud is only a fraction of the holding over in the sandy mud, regardless of which anchor choice you make. But the anchors that do best here should probably be given extra credit. There's something to be said for the anchors that do the best in the worst seabeds. Last test I will show you today is a brand new protocol. It is a reset test in the soft mud. Now, unlike the sandy mud reset, I only pass the boat over at 2 knots. But maybe this is a little better simulation of real-world conditions. We'll see here, though, that the anchor has emerged from the seabed after being deeply buried, but it is inverted. We are looking downward at the underside of the fluke. It is just perfectly stable. Never did get it to reset on this pull. I stopped the boat, like right here, and then restarted motion again. Of course, I can tell I'm moving by the GPS and the waves moving by. But it was incredibly stable in this condition, which is completely opposite of these Mantus M1 anchors in other seabeds. They are just tenacious in their ability to self-right or stay in the upright position, but nope, here it is very stable. I'm assuming the roll bar was embedded into the seabed and just sort of oozing along quite happily. So here's another passover, and I think the anchor did another flip, so to speak, but since it was inverted, it flipped into the upright position and reset immediately. So that's good. Again, this anchor does so well on other seabeds, it's really kind of shocking that it had that tendency. Let's see what happens on the third try. Boat's passed over. It's taken up some stretch there in the nylon portion of the road. Looked to me like the anchor came out of the seabed maybe with a list, maybe about 90 degrees, and then it reset, stopped the boat. I'm giving the engine a good burst of power, about 2,000 RPM on each reset. Here's the fourth try. And once again, we're partially inverted. See a little bit of a twig there. I'm not sure if that's a factor or not. Now the anchor has gone from partially inverted to perfectly inverted. So that's really fascinating that it has negative stability in the inverted condition in this soft mud. Again, I'm assuming that the roll bar has penetrated the seabed and is happily dragging along through that substrate. Now, if I burst the boat speed up high enough and then chop the power, something would change and it would go ahead and reset. Here's the fifth try. So it was from a reset condition. I've passed overhead. And I don't know if the anchor is upside down or not, but there's a big ball floating along there. And there, now we can see it is upside down. That's just the toe of the anchor. So apparently it had a massive ball of seabed attached to it at some point. I still think there is a lot of seabed associated with it. That eventually will slough off. On retrieval, the anchor came up clean. So I've stopped the boat and restarted motion again. Now I think it cleaned itself off, and then it immediately flipped right back upright. That was a fair amount of boat speed that I was using there. Again, maybe the high speed tends to make that clump knock off. Here's the last reset, and again, we've got an inverted anchor and motion. Going real fast with the boat this time. Looks like it's shed whatever blob may have had, but again, very, very stable inverted condition. And then finally something happens and anchor rolled upright, set, and stopped the boat. Okay, that was take one for the resetting Mantus. Only 2 good quick resets. Otherwise it took a fair amount of dragging. Even a burst of speed would then reset. So call it 2 out of 5 solid, 3 not so good. I'm gonna go ahead and reset because we picked up stuff. A stick, and a rope. So here's take 2 for the soft mud reset, and it was the same story. The first one was the only footage I got. After that was a fouled camera. We'll see the anchor does end up upside down and fairly stable initially. It does, however, roll itself right back upright. So I'll go ahead and let the topside commentary explain what happened with the other poles on this test.
Probably not a lot of footage out of this one. The first reset was marginal, took a bit of coaxing. The next three were quite good. And then the last one had a long drag at 2,000 RPM, and then it was at the increased boat speed, several knots. And then as soon as this boat speed decayed, it set. And that seemed to happen frequently. A burst of speed seems to help anchors set here. I've had 4 or 5 anchors now that would not set under various conditions, dragging along slowly, and then drag them faster, and lo and behold, they would set. And we've got more wood here. We have no idea when that wood was collected. Maybe it was on the last one. Hard to know. And obviously the camera was really fouled up in the roll bar. Probably not going to get much footage.
So I have gone ahead and entered the 55-pound M1 data into the 45-pound range anchor ranking chart. We'll see that the question of does a heavier anchor have an advantage? That has been answered for us. It does. We see the 43-pound Mantus M1 is well below the 55-pounder. Not a huge difference in total average. The 43-pounder has a 4, and the 55-pounder has a 4.2. Now, in a perfect world, we'd like to see all these anchors just weigh exactly the same. That'd be the best comparison. But if they did, my gut here tells me that they wouldn't change ranking a whole lot. Maybe just 1 or 2 spots would reshuffle around. But for the most part, I think the ranking of this chart, in terms of these tests, is pretty accurate. Again, I've normalized a lot of these performance columns, about half of them, meaning that I've divided the result by the anchor weight to come up with a score. So those are apples to apples. And the rest, I think, are close enough that we can pretty much just assume that this ranking is going to follow regardless of these discrepancies in anchor weight. Now, the exception to that last statement is with the 40-pound Knox. 40 pounds considerably less weight than those anchors at the top of the chart. So I would assume that if you did have a Knox that weighed in that upper 40 or 50-pound range, that it would likely be several notches higher on this chart. So let's talk a little more about that, what I call a partial mud fouling issue that these M1 anchors have in that sandy mud seabed. In the beginning of the video, we talked about how the scantlings were beefed up on the shank and the bolts and this mounting plate compared to the 45-pound anchor. Well, it's great for strength, but maybe it's not so good for this fouling. There's just more stuff, bigger stuff, for that mud to cling to. I kind of call this the bolt graveyard on these M1 anchors, kind of tongue-in-cheek, but, you know, it's not good. I'm virtually certain that the anchor would be better off if this could all be smooth. We do have another piece of evidence for that, and that happens to be with this Mantus dinghy anchor. It shares the same general shape, but you'll notice it has no bolts at all sticking up. It sort of clicks together with these rivets on the underside. But no, this anchor is fantastic in that same sandy mud seabed. It never packs in, it just dives out of sight, and it just makes absolutely phenomenal holding power for its size. So again, big bolts are great for strength. Maybe they're not so good for holding in a seabed that can tend to pack in and become sort of solid masses around the anchor. In the soft mud, it's a non-issue. I believe that material never becomes solidified around the anchor. I think it just keeps moving, and that's what you want. Allows the anchor to just keep diving and diving. One more thing I want to mention before I go is that Panopé is going in the water here in the next 2 or 3 weeks. It's been a 2-year break from sailing for me, and it is high time this boat goes in the water. Now, I'm going to go ahead and put the Sarka Excel number 5 in the bow roller and cruise around this summer with that anchor. And I'll just say that any anchor that you see in this boat's home bow roller position, it doesn't necessarily mean that that's my pick or my favorite anchor. I'm simply going to cruise around with all kinds of different anchors, and maybe at some point I'll give sort of a long-term real world use assessment. You know, what do I think of these anchors after cruising around with them for a while? Thus far in my life, I have used the following anchors sort of long-term on this vessel, and those would be CQR, Bruce, Manson Supreme, Galvanized, Spade, and Ultra. So again, this year I'll put the Excel on there and see what happens. Now you might wonder, why not one of these larger roll bar anchors like the Mantus M1, which would be great, or the 51-pound Viking? That would also be a fantastic anchor performance-wise. And the reason is this new bowsprit that I have constructed over the winter. That bowsprit articulates, obviously. You can see it has a pivot point, and right now it is pointing straight down. At the dock, for the purpose of keeping dock fees low, that bowsprit will point straight up. However, when the bowsprit is in the normal outward extended position, it's going to interfere and contact the roll bars of pretty much any roll bar anchor. I haven't actually fitted all the anchors up there to see how it will work, but it's a certainty that those large, tall roll bars will interfere with that. Now, when the bowsprit is pointed skyward, then it'll work just fine, but having to partially release the anchors just so that I can extend the bowsprit for sailing, that's a non-starter. That's no good. So we could probably say that this boat is going to be relegated to non-roll bar anchors only at this point. Okay, that's all I got for now. I'll give another big thanks to the folks who've been chipping in with donations. That sure goes a long way toward offsetting the costs of doing the tests and making the videos. If you want to join them, there are links to Patreon and PayPal down in the video description below. All right, as always, anchor safely, and we'll see you next time. So long.